in this kind of month to 6 weeks before putting in real red point goes. And it could be tactical things, once a week getting out to the project, things I could be focusing on or others are focusing on since this is the season. Or it could be training.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's two things I'd probably like to make sure people kind of grasp these two concepts. Is one, that the ancillary training that you're doing that might be off the wall, so stuff on a pull-up bar, TRX, floor-based core work, bar work, etc., in complement to your training, you want to be really careful about the amount of that you do in peak season. It's essentially, this goes into kind of like the junk mileage category. There's not a great deal of point in doing that. It's just making you more fatigued. It costs you quality in the sessions where it's really counting as part of the year. You know, like only a quarter of your year at max may be peak shape. So don't go and waste a load of that by additionally doing a load of pull-ups on top of it. So really pull that out and understand that that will come at a cost to performance if you keep it in too much. And then the other aspect with your climbing is that when you're getting right into peak season is really think about the demands of your project and make sure that those are represented in your climbing sessions and your training in that period. Don't do too much that doesn't look like your project. But likewise, a caveat that goes with it, don't overdo it. So for example, if you are going to try your project 2 days a week, let's say both days of the weekend, for example, and it's got some really core intensive hard knee barring in it, it's probably going to be a mistake to do another additional 2 hard knee bar replica sessions midweek to complement that. Because suddenly now you're doing 4 hard knee bar sessions in a week, and that could be too much. But one, yeah, that could be, just right. And that could be perfect. But I wouldn't want to see someone doing, I don't know, what would they do for knee barring that would be, let's say they were hanging by a bar from their toes and they were doing kind of upside down sit-ups from their toes. That doesn't represent the kind of like specifics of knee bar core ability. It's a bit broad and vague and generalist. So that's a waste of time. But being on the wall and actually knee barring against an actual hold indoors and doing that once a week, yes, useful use of time.
Yeah, that's great. Similarly, then that kind of analogy there. If your project is hard crimping, if your project is a ton of maybe sub-maximal jug hauling, doing some of that when you're not on the project, good to keep specific with your training. But doing too much of it, you're just risking overly fatiguing that system or potentially injury.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And those both go together. Being fatigued all the time and injury incidents, there's a definite tie for those two.
All right, y'all, just a quick 30 seconds here to shout out the sponsor of this video, PhysiVantage Nutrition, the best of the best when it comes to climbing performance nutrition. I've been using it for years. I think you're going to love it, but don't take my word for it. Check out their athlete team. Oh my gosh, Alex Magos, Jonathan Siegrist, Daniel Woods, Paige Clausen, Natalia Grossman, Amity Warm, Jordan Cannon. There's too many to name, y'all. They're using PhysiVantage every single day because it works. I think you're going to love it. Just give it a shot. Use code STRUGGLE at checkout for 15% off and take your performance to the next level. All right, let's get back to the video. So how much fatigue should I allow, or how fresh should I be as I'm going out and then working on the project? And I'm assuming that ratio will start to change a little bit as I get a little bit closer to actually wanting to put in some big links and that kind of thing. But how should I look at that, or how do you look at that?
I mean, normally for any climber transitioning into the peak part of their season is that you're going from this pattern of higher volume training where the overall training load is causing overload. So we want overload to create that adaptation and the improvement, whether it's strength, power endurance, etc. And so when we transfer into the peak season, what we're trying to do is pull off the overall training load so that we're not in this overload cycle all the time. And we're more into that kind of sort of super compensation or sped, you can sort of term it up, sort of sped up adaptation or consistent adaptation cycle, where you're just seeing the improvements from all the base work that you put in week after week. And the natural way in which we do this with training is we'll often just kind of segue the two together, and they'll stitch together in a sort of a spectrum of easing from one thing into the other, not because you can't just do a hard stop on one and start the other sort of modality of training, so going down to low volume and higher intensity work, but more because when you first go and try your project for the season, you're just learning moves and you are starting to put together just some familiarity of the route. It doesn't matter that you're not going to be red pointing in it yet, so you don't really need to be fully recovered and on peak form. And then secondly is that one of the, I suppose you could call it downsides, but maybe just something to be aware of for any climber, is that when you get into peak shape and you're in this sort of constant tapering cycle, or you're trying to feel your very best, the overall load of training has to be quite low to the point where you're actually going to effectively start to detrain from all that hard work you did. So if you sustain a peak load, or how much load you have to be in peak shape for a long time, you're going to detrain and, in air quotes, lose those improvements that you had in peak season. So it's a compromise, it's a balance.
If I'm hearing correctly, it's okay to bring a little bit of fatigue then into these earlier project days. Sure, I might not be as snappy as I could be if I had taken off a full 2 days prior to that day out at the crag, but that's not necessary if I'm going to be hang dogging and working out moves and that kind of thing. And it's important to keep that volume up now so that as I taper, maybe in 4 weeks, that's when I start to feel like piping strong and fresh.
It's certainly an approach that you can take. I think it's really important to understand that the approach that's going on with your training at the moment is not the only approach. You could argue, for example, if you had someone that was in a very similar position to you and has not spent very much time going through this journey of overload, feeling quite fatigued, doing a training cycle, then eventually bringing it to sort of success with project at the end, and they don't feel super confident with that when they go out into their projecting season, and if it psychologically is really hard for them to deal with feeling quite tired and having crappy kind of links and not feeling that great on the project, you might argue that person needs to be deloaded a lot faster so that they don't have to deal with that psychological burden if they're not yet in the state where they can deal with that or work with that productively. So it will come somewhat down to the individual, really, that approach. And then the other thing to be aware of as well is that if you are an injury prone climber and you have a project which is very, very high intensity in terms of like the difficulty of the move, so very bouldery versus more kind of long end power endurance or very endurancey, is that if you carry too much fatigue into those early projecting sessions, you're just increasing your risk a little with the injury side of things, actually working on that project, especially if you're going out multiple times a week. So that's another part of it to kind of consider in the equation.